Hi, everyone. Thanks for taking your Saturday morning to spend some time with me. The last couple of weeks have really been a whirlwind for everybody everywhere in the world, and particularly for my team here at San Francisco Digital Services, which is part of the city government of San Francisco. It's really been a huge whirlwind. I've barely had time to really do anything else. And so I thought it'd be interesting to take a step back from that and share some of the things that we've done and some of the thoughts that we've had along the way. So this session is about an inside look into the work that we've been doing, as well as an insight look into how teams like mine work. So as Diwaka says, I've been a founder for many years. I've led product in various ways as a founder, as a PM, as like a consultant for many, many more years than I've been a founder or a product director. And since 2000, like many of you, I have been dabbling, hacking, doing stuff on the web, building things. Sometimes some of it is useful. Since 2000, I've been doing it for work. In college, I was, building websites, building apps with friends for companies and things like that. Between 2008 and 2018, I ran some startups. I also worked in some others, had a pretty interesting background in some of these companies. And then in 2018, I moved to San Francisco, and I've been living and working here ever since. So last year, if you look at my Twitter profile, I had the opportunity to change focus. Instead of working at early stage startups like I've been the whole time, I instead moved to work in a 32,000 person company or organization rather, and that's the local city government of San Francisco. So, politics is very slightly different here. You have the federal government that manages things on the national level, and then you have the state government. So for us, the capital of California is in Sacramento, about 2 hours away. But locally, there's also local governments, not just San Francisco. There's also Alameda, there's also San Jose. Maybe many of you have friends who, work at Google or, companies like that down south in other parts of Bay Area. All of these are run by different local governments, so to speak. And so this was a great opportunity for me for various ways, because I felt like I was able to jump into a world that I didn't really know about, but that, I was able to learn a lot from. So what do we mean when we talk about GovTech or digital services? I don't think there's really a start date for the industry, but to me, I definitely started paying attention to it around 2012, 2013. As you might know, there was a big fiasco that happened because the public found out that the Obama administration at the time had spent more than $500 million, closer to $900 million on an outsourced website called healthcare.gov that didn't really work. And people were very upset about that. And a bunch of people came together and said, hey, I think we could do that cheaper and better. And these were folks from the private sector who just took some time off, and they came together to try to build a better healthcare.gov because the stakes were really high. It was supposed to be a marketplace for like insurance. And you might know that, insurance and healthcare here is a really, really big deal. And so from that group, there were people who then went on to start or lead organizations like United States Digital Service and 18F. And so all this stuff is happening at the federal level. And then in Europe, you had organizations like GDS that is part of the cabinet in the UK that has really been doing phenomenal work around government. So if you go to like UK government websites, whether it's to apply for a visa or to get information about anything, you can always see that like content is very clear. You can always see that like you actually know what you're supposed to do, which compared to many other governments is quite a big achievement. And then Estonia, of course, is also a leading player in the e-government space. They have a program called e-residency, where anyone who lives anywhere in the world can apply to be an electronic resident of Estonia. And so that makes it easy if, for example, you wanted to open a bank account in the EU, but you don't actually live there, but as an e-resident of Estonia, you're able to do that. So that was all very progressive and very exciting. And in Asia and Singapore, where I'm from, the GovTech division has been doing some pretty phenomenal work. And but I unfortunately haven't been a part of that. So just to give you a sense of what it's like, on a city level, there's San Francisco Digital Services. Other cities are starting to have teams like ours, but our team is probably one of the largest ones in the US right now. On a state level, New York and California have also put teams together like this. And then on a national level, you have, again, the Singapore GovTech service and the UK government digital service team working on really good work. So my boss who started this team, she actually came from the UK to start it. And she wrote a really interesting post on Medium saying that one of the key differences is that unlike say in the UK or even Singapore, where you have like a cabinet minister saying, hey, we should do this, and then everybody else eventually does it. Here, it's a very noisy place. And it's a lot about building a coalition. It's a lot about building relationships and getting trust in the city instead of just doing something because you have to. So that type of like setup, because like the government is set up so differently from everywhere else, means that sometimes it can be harder than usual to really like move ahead and get things done. When I started, I found that when I wanted to get a Zoom account, I couldn't just put my credit card, for example, and claim it later. I had to go through this really long process that took several weeks where I had to like explain what it was, why I needed it. And, in hindsight, it was great that we got it, but there was just an example of how slow things can move for good reason, mostly because we're spending taxpayers' money and you want to be absolutely sure that that money is spent for like things that you really need. There are some folks in the ecosystem. This is very US centric, but I'm sure there are other similar organizations as well in other places. So some of these are vendors that work with government to like build very specific things. So for example, Citybase is a vendor that provides a lot of the e-payment stuff for a lot of government in the US. You can't just like use Stripe for various reasons. But there's stuff like that out there. There's usually like a version of a product that we use in the private sector in the public sector. Then there are like partners who build software. They might be a private company, but their software might be targeted at government. So that would be a company like Remix, which does transit planning software. So they sell software that helps like city planners plan like bus stops or like colors of the curbs that you paint, or even like, how do you manage a fleet of scooters in a city if you've got like too many and then like you don't know where to put the docking stations and things like that. So they do really interesting stuff that's very different from a lot of the other work that I've seen out there in the private sector. So about 6 months ago, I joined this team largely because I wanted work-life balance. I've worked in, early stage startups for a really long time. And yeah, it's just this constant being on all the time, being on call and fixing things as they happen. The sky is falling on your head all the time. And so largely that's been true. I think that in this type of environment, there are a lot of strong protections. We're part of a union, for example, which is unheard of for other companies here in the US. We have like very strong rules about like being paid for like overtime work and things like that. So that was great. And in general, I think I was having a lot of time to like really recharge and like think about like doing good work, but then being able to like also live a life. But in the last couple of weeks, because of this virus, all of that has been thrown for now temporarily out of the window, because we've had to really like rush and like figure things out overnight because this thing like hit us so fast. So some of the things that we worked on, this is just in the last 2 weeks, my team built an application form for businesses to get reimbursed for paying their employees for their extra time off. And this is actually a very significant project because the stakes were really high. It wasn't just like a regular project where you could be like, oh, I might ship it on Wednesday or I might ship it on Friday. or, you know, the stakes were high in the sense that like any delay by like 1 or 2 days actually meant that like somebody might not get paid the whole like amount of money in time, and they might be, for example, they might be homeless. Whereas if you shipped it like a day early, they might be paid right on the correct date in payroll. It's just very confusing how payroll and like sick leave works here. But the short version of that is that we were able to get this grant going. The mayor announced it one afternoon, and I think the following week by the Tuesday, we had the app live and ready to go. And so, as you can tell, a lot of things are happening on the fly. A lot of like new programs are happening all the time. And the complication is that that also means that policy is being decided while we are building the product. So it's not just like we have a very fixed scope. It's like we have a very broad scope, but then we have to make sure that we work with partners in other parts of the city who are going to be the experts in saying that actually we should change it here and we should change it there. And I was glad to know that we processed almost $10 million in just 2 weeks. And that, you know, the team is very proud that we were able to like help make a difference to people's lives in that sense. And then very shortly after that, like I think literally 2 days after that, we were told that we were going to put up a coronavirus testing site on the pier for all frontline city employees. And so that's like firemen, that's like police people, that's like nurses. And so we had to work with the people who were literally putting up tents and literally like giving out like these tests and performing them. And then we had to build that whole end-to-end software for them to go from how do we identify people who should do the test, and how do we like get information from them, how do we have them schedule this thing, how do we remind them to go, and then more importantly, how do we get the information back, and if it's negative or positive, what do we do about that? So these were definitely a lot of considerations that I've never really had to think about in the private sector before. And lastly, we also had to work on a very big piece of work where if government buildings are shut, then how can like, you know, people continue to do certain things? And a lot of these things can be done online, but unfortunately, you don't always have the infrastructure that's ready to be switched on. So I'll just show you some screens from this. You can see here, this is sf.gov. This is our main website for the city. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. It was pretty simple to put up a website, but you know, there's just a lot of things that really have to go into it. As a city with so many people from all backgrounds, English isn't the only language. We had to go from, okay, how do we make this available also in like Cantonese, also in Filipino, and also in Spanish all at the same time. And so, you know, when I started here, I asked like my CTO, the person who does my job, but for the engineering team, I was like, what's the hardest thing that you think I should know about in this industry? Because he had also been in the private sector before, but he had more government experience. And he said, you're going to be really surprised by how difficult forms are. And I was like, really? That can't be right. Like forms are just forms. And I'm sad to say, but like I actually completely understand why it's hard now. And I can go into more detail about that later. But we shipped this in actually a couple of days. And we were able to help a lot of businesses, you know, just do a little bit better economically. It was probably one of the highlights of my career, because when I was looking through the data, I was like, I know like most of these businesses, I've bought like, you know, bread from there, or I've had like a meal here like some time ago. And just knowing that I was in a bar like, you know, a week before, and now the waiters who served us was probably unemployed, and that the software had probably helped like process the last amount of her paycheck that she's going to see for some time. I think that was extremely sobering, but also like a good reminder of why we do this work that we do. So this is a picture that shows people standing outside a building waiting to queue up with like gigantic rolls of paper that contain architectural drawings. So you might have heard, but you know, in San Francisco, housing is a really big issue in that we don't have enough of it, and it takes a really long time to build it, and it's really expensive. It takes like, you know, anything from 6 months to 6 years really to get like approvals to change something in your house or like build a room in your garage, for example. So these were people who on most days would just be standing outside waiting to get in and to submit these gigantic documents that they spend a lot of money printing. And then they were going to have to go to do the same thing in like 10 other places in other parts of the city. They probably have to take a day off work to go do that. And so right after shipping that form, we were like, I guess we have to build like some sort of file upload system, but not just a file upload system, but also a file upload system that would work with all of the existing government infrastructure. And so we shipped that a couple of days after that. And so that was great that for the first time in the history of San Francisco, you no longer have to print out these gigantic rolls of paper, only to have it put in storage somewhere. And then shortly after, we had to start building the test scheduling program for the frontline employees. And this was a picture from the first day. It looks kind of apocalyptic, but you know, it was raining that day as well. The blue stuff, the blue sign that you see there, I think that was also from our team. We care a lot about like branding in order to like establish credibility, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. We helped with the workflow of what happens when, for example, you drive into this test, and like who greets you, what information gets recorded, what happens next, how do you get told to go somewhere, where do you wait. We were able to, because we have a team of people called service designers. I guess I think of them as like UX designers, but like for like real life and the offline world. And so we also have service designers who really work with us to make sure that the online and offline experience works really well together. And so that's what we did. This is a table that I made as a joke, but I think the more I think about it, the more I like it. And so if you look at, I think for me, the most important things like what drives you as a person. Obviously, this type of industry is not for everybody. I certainly didn't think that I would be a public servant one day, because I was always like this very anti-government person back in Singapore. But I think after working in startups for a really long time, I got personally tired of the idea of like working my ass off for like, you know, growth metrics or like VC driven metrics. And I was really driven by the idea of being able to be of service to a community, especially to a community that has become my home. So I actually remember that when I was in a job interview for this job, one of the questions they asked was like, you know, what would your people who have worked with you say about you and like what drives you? And I had actually prepared that, and I had asked my co-founder in Indonesia to write a few lines about me. And he, you know, it stuck with me that he said, Adrianna is unstoppable when equipped with a mission. And so I feel very strongly that this has been a mission, and it continues to be one until we recover from it. And so it doesn't feel like work. It feels like something that I just have to do. And so obviously there are things that I don't like about it. For example, like how slow things can be. For example, like how you have to follow so much red tape and like do things and fill out all these forms. And sometimes you have to work with infrastructure that's so old that we don't even know like what it's built in, and nobody does. But all in, I think it is a challenge, and it is a great opportunity at this point in time where the more we talk about this type of work that we do, the more we're hearing from people that, hey, I also want to do something that makes a difference, and I want to like apply my skills to that. And so I feel really like lucky that I'm able to like apply the things that I learned and like, you know, put that in the service of helping someone recover from this, either from the virus or from the economic impact of it. And so that's really what has been exciting for me. Every city needs a good usable website, I believe. Not an app, not a chatbot. It really needs a basic usable website. We were really lucky that when the virus hit and things got really bad, compared to a lot of cities, we actually had already done a lot of work and investment on the infrastructure around how we communicate things as a city. And for us, that was through sf.gov. Before this team was founded, there were, I think, 250 websites for the city of San Francisco. There was one website for every department. And then there were websites that departments had forgotten about. And then there were like campaign websites where they might be like, you know, wash your hands and here's a website for that. And people would like forget how to log into it. And it was just a different way of doing things. But when a digital services team came together, the objective was not to be an agency that would serve the city. Our stakeholders were not the city departments or like the boss of some other department. It wasn't to help give them a free website. It was actually to, for the first time, come together and say, how can we serve the people? So that to me has been the defining moment when I try to explain the work that we do, that the people that we serve are the public, and you know, they don't care what your org chart looks like. They don't care what you look like. If you're applying for a permit to do something that requires like 5 departments to like do things on it, they don't care that they shouldn't have to care that 5 different departments process it differently. It should all feel like one seamless service. So that has really been the gold standard towards like what we built sf.gov for. So it looks very simple, but underneath all that is a very service-driven approach. So it's no longer like who is this department, but rather what can you do for the people. And so that's why the majority of our site is service-based, and you can do pretty much everything there. And we're starting to like migrate more and more services from other departments onto it. And so I say that we were lucky to have it because we were, I think, the first US city and area to go into lockdown in early March, sorry. And because we had such a strong team working on this website, that also meant that we had a very strong standard around like how we write. And so content is very often an afterthought, but here it's everything. Because we do things like we specifically choose simple language, we avoid the use of jargon. We make sure that people around the age of 10 would be able to read all of the communications that we put out and understand exactly what we're talking about. That is actually really important to me because this place is a city that has many, for example, migrants for whom English might not be the first language. So they either need to have simple English or they depend on their children to help them interpret like important information such as this. So we wrote all of this. We basically digested the legal order and we like made it very clear. It came down to exactly what businesses should stay open and what should close. It came down to like ideas for like people who don't know how to cook. We said you could use like certain services. And compared to a lot of other cities that went on lockdown shortly after, I think the response was generally that we had the clearest information and that other cities were using our information as a guideline, and that people who were in other cities were also looking on a website for information on what to do because they didn't feel like their government was giving them that information. So this was something that we are very proud of. We also designed the signs all over the city. And as you can see here, there's the simple graphics, the simple branding, clear branding. There's like a very clear, this is what we want you to do, available in several languages at once. So it felt like we weren't just doing stuff in the online world. It was also like stuff that we could see that was impacting people, helping them understand things outside. And then obviously we made t-shirts internally for that, which will be fun to wear in a couple of years, I think. So I just want to go back for a moment and talk about this whole idea around having a simple website that's easy to read and understand, and what it meant during the lockdown. So during the lockdown, when it happened, there was obviously a lot of potential for mass panic. If you are panicking and you're standing in line at a grocery store and you're like, what is going on? And then you're trying to read information about it, and it sounds like they're really big words and things that you don't understand, and it sounds like a crisis, like pandemic and this and that. You're gonna feel like, I don't understand this. This must mean it's bad. So by focusing a lot of the content and the delivery and the accessibility of it, we were able to, I think, really help reduce panic significantly. So here's like some, some feedback we got from like other folks who are working on like local government or state government elsewhere. And so basically you're just like, we should just copy our San Francisco's entire page. Because, usually with frequently asked questions, they're not that frequently asked, but I think we did a good job striking the balance in reducing panic, giving right information at the right time. We wouldn't have been able to do that if we didn't have all these things in the first place, that we had a site that was usable, that people knew about. It sort of felt like it was a defining moment for us, because before there was sfgov.org, there was like Department of Public Health, there was like all of these different websites all at once. And like, where do you go if you have like 250 different websites and you don't know where to get information? Sometimes the information is repeating itself. So given that we acted really quickly, the mayor referred to it, other departments referred to it, and I think we got a lot of like credibility from that. It helped us really like get the word out in just one place so that like information doesn't get lost, which is super important in a time like this. Again, I come back to content, like, I think the content people are probably the most important people in our team next to the engineers, because they really are like such experts in making sure that information is digestible, which time and again, especially now, has proven to be super important. And because of the structure of the government, we call it a federated government. There's like so many departments. Nobody knows who reports to who. Some people don't even, they don't have to do things the way we want them to. But I think that by having developed good relationships as an organization, as well as personally, I think that we were able to move quickly and just like move past some disagreements we might have and ship things because people just really, really needed them. So this was like day 2 of the lockdown. I think that this is stuff that we collected from all over. It was really heartening to know. I mean, I have always been somewhat of a writer, but I've never really felt that like writing was like this type of vital skill that could really like impact the way people thought about things. And so this definitely made me appreciate the like content first approach and strategy that we have taken. So even when like today I had a meeting about building more products in the grant space, because obviously as we start thinking about recovery, there are going to be so many businesses that are not going to reopen after this because they just don't have any money anymore. But how do we like help some of them keep going? And I think that, for many governments everywhere, the answer has been in giving grants of different sizes, giving short-term, like long-term, short-term loans, and just more importantly, just making it accessible like right now, instead of like it's something that'll come later when we've figured it out. So even in having meetings like that, it's been clear to me that like, government folks don't always think from a user perspective. And this has also been something that our team has been really focused on. We've been focused on like, okay, great, you want there to be like 10 different like conditionals because that's what it means for your like policy, but what does it mean for like the end user, right? So I think even just being out there and being an advocate for the public and the end user is super important. And I see that as our role really. And so I will continue to do that.
Hey, Adrianna,
go ahead.
Sorry, this is Abhinav. So I noticed that the last couple of slides you focused a lot on the communication, right? So just out of curiosity, is there is there some way that you guys had figured out what straightforward, clear communication is, or did you have a set of rules, or did you run this by a set of people? Because you mentioned that the people who will actually consume this information are like come from a very diverse set of backgrounds, right? So how did you kind of ensure that you got that right?
Yeah, so I think this comes down to how a lot of the founding members of the team had experience doing exactly this work in the UK government. And so they brought with them a certain like content playbook around how they should write. And I remember the first day I started, I actually wrote a blog post about how excited I was to join it, and they sent it back, and they gave me a link to something called Hemingway Editor or something like that. And they were like, please rewrite it until it says a 10-year-old can understand what you've written. And I was just like, I think I'm a pretty good writer, but this is like really, really hard, right? So having that culture in the team, I think made us come naturally to this point. But then if I had to really break down the steps, it would be that we had like a strong content strategy in place that was always there from the beginning. From the time this team was started, it was always about no jargon, no big words, no like even things like metaphors. You can't like refer to things metaphorically because they're just like, if you don't speak English natively, you're not going to understand a metaphor, like even a simple one, or rather we can't assume that you do. So just no metaphors at all. So there were rules like that. Then there were like team members who were really experts in their field. So like, you know, for example, we have one writer who used to work on dictionary.com. And so that was like fantastic. We have a person who looks at accessibility. And so she's looking at our content and reviewing it with like a screen reader or like something in audio in order to understand how somebody who might not be sighted would like process this information. So all of those things were in place. I don't think we really sat down and said we should reduce panic and therefore we should do this, but it was more of an outcome of a set of things that we had already been practicing this whole time. So I'm sure that different organizations will come to this point differently, but there has to be like a higher level buy-in into how important this strategy is. And I think that even if you're building a product that is selling something, in marketing, if you can like find some way to, you know, to figure out what works best for your industry or your product, and it could really like help you like do better. And so I think that this is something that applies to everybody and not just to government, just that in a government context, the negative outcome of not doing it well in terms of communication is like actual like physical, like social chaos and not like losing money, for example. So I hope that helps.
Yep, that makes sense.
Yeah. So shortly after that, we saw an FAQ from the United States Postal Service. And I don't even know what a question was, but we took a screenshot of this because it's just like, what are they saying? I think the question actually was something like, will the post office be open throughout this time? And it's like, if I look at this, it's like, why do I have to why do I have to know anything after yes, right? And so in our team, this would be what would happen, I'm sure. So I think the best part of my job has been about being able to put a human face to the government as well as to the public. So I remember that, you know, before I started this job, I was always like, why are government services so bad? Why are they building stuff on like, I don't know, Oracle, Java, whatever. But then being able to be in that part of the action and to understand the constraints on several fronts has really helped me understand why things have been so bad this whole time, and also to understand how we can hopefully move the needle forward a little bit and make things better, and to be able to see that it has an impact on people, like literally, is just amazing. And so I think that, you know, to what I said earlier about why things have been so bad, and it's just that we're not on the same level in a lot of ways. That if you think about selling your app or your tool or service to the government, you're going to be like, oh my God, it's going to be like a 2-year long like procurement process, or like it's so opaque, or I don't understand how it works. And it's true. Procurement is definitely, I think, one of the biggest challenges. We don't even use the same tools, but I think this is changing. But for a very long time, a lot of government firewalls, like it didn't even allow like Google Docs, for example. But now I'm glad to say that we're at a point where people are starting to sort of, I think, standardize in the same set of tools, because they've come to expect that I use these tools at home and I should have the same tools at work, or I should at least have the same level of like, ease of use. I shouldn't have to use like shitty, outdated enterprise software. And so I think that for me personally, I'm excited about this move away from very long development cycles and long sales cycles of just enterprise software, in which only like, honestly, only 1 to 2, maybe 5 vendors can really like provide that level of support and customization that we need, towards having teams where we are able to go, okay, we're not going to get a perfect solution, but we can put things together, buy things when needed, build them where we can, and make it work for us. And so definitely, as part of my job as the director of product here, it's been a lot of, we should buy this thing and we should like, build this other thing. And as long as it works, we should be, pretty proud of it, instead of waiting for like a Salesforce or an Oracle to take like 2 years developing some really custom thing that will only work for one project. By doing it this way, we are able to emphasize reusability, because obviously we can use the same platforms in multiple places, but we also learn each time we use certain things, what has worked and what hasn't. And the cost of doing that is just so much lower compared to a lot of these enterprise products. So, I think that lately I'm starting to see a lot of really good folks move into government roles for various reasons. I think that for some of us, it's just that we really feel like we want to like give back to the community. And for some of us, it's just a different challenge. But I think an important thing to state is that I think, for many of us, we get to that point in our lives where we're just like, okay, I know all these things now what good can I do with it, right? And so more and more people are doing good work in government. And I also feel like there's a much higher level of understanding on like how software should be built. People really are just, they're not stupid, but they're constrained, I think, by the way things have always been, or by like certain procedures. And a lot of times these procedures or protocols are in place for a very, very good reason. But there is, I think, overall a desire to do more, to learn more, and to like do things better. And I think that over the next couple of years, we're going to see like really huge like leaps and bounds in terms of the like level of software that like the public can expect from government. And hopefully, I think this goes to like other countries, and also to like the national level as well, because I think that on a national level, it's just much harder to do things at that scale. And they don't always communicate very much with other states or with each other. So yeah, I'm really personally looking forward to this increase in momentum in people who want to do this type of work, and people who are going to be able to achieve certain types of like work. So throughout the rest of this pandemic, if it ends at all, I would like to build software that supports everything related to the pandemic and the recovery of it. And I've been really glad to know that, today I was told that I cannot commit to a certain project by a certain time, because, our developers have kids, and we absolutely have to make sure that at this time that they're supported. And so there was like, for me, a really big difference in culture in terms of how we think about people, that I think we do take them into account. And I was able to say, you know what, I worked like a lot of weekends and nights. Recently, I'm going to take like the weekend off and not do anything. And that was actually seen as like a good thing, like a thing that I should do. So I was really glad to do that because, you know, as Diwaka mentioned, I previously worked at Uber, and that was the complete opposite of that. So I think just the culture of caring for people while we build software that is sustainable is super important to me. I think also that we are doing things in certain ways where later, when the time is right, I think that we can actually put a measurement to how much time or money or resources we changed or helped in some way. And so I'm excited to keep doing the work that we do, but then with a mind of, okay, this is something that we can and should measure later. Not because it makes us feel good, but I think because it will be like an actual indicator of like the value of the type of work that we do. And, you know, we haven't always had a playbook, to be honest. It's been a series of someone gets a phone call, an hour later, we scramble a team, and a couple of days later, we have to launch something. I've been thinking a little bit about doing software in this time as a bit of like a chaos monkey of the world. Like, you know, if everything breaks, like, you know, what are you going to do to get systems back up? And so I feel like eventually we will have a playbook for how we not only do things in an emergency, but also how we think about products later for like long-term resiliency. And also I want to be able to continue establishing the foundation for doing things in a way that is reusable. There's a lot of talk about like having a patent library where if we do like grant applications for like business, it should look like this, right? But before we didn't have any of these things. It was just like putting something together that just worked. Whereas now if I were to go to the second, third, fourth like grant application project, I'm like, this is how this is what the blocks are like, and this is what it'll look like broadly. And we can, you know, we can make changes, of course, but it will just help everybody generally if we were doing things in a way that was reusable. And to consider inclusivity and accessibility, even as we focus on speed, because, you know, again, this is not a growth metric driven sort of work. We spent a lot of time and effort putting out translations for some of these forms in all these languages, knowing that maybe the number of people who click on them might be really small. So today, one of my developers was like, well, only 17 people like read the site or used this service in like this language. And I was like, yeah, but as long as it helps even one person, I think that's the goal of why we focus on inclusivity and accessibility. That, you know, it's not about the numbers, it's about whether or not it's even there at all, because so often in tech, like those things are just an afterthought, or it's just something that we like think about later. But I truly believe that like it can be and should be thought about from the very start. But maybe that's another topic for another day. So in 6 months, I think I've come to the point where I feel like I don't know if I could do anything else. I don't know if I could go back to anything else, because it feels like a huge challenge, but it also feels like a really satisfying puzzle to unlock, especially knowing that this isn't the sort of place where you could just have someone important tell somebody else that you have to do this. It becomes, for me, an increasingly interesting puzzle, because then it's about how do you like talk about your work? How do you get buy-in from people? How do you, you know, like get to a point where you're able to do all these things, but also like, you know, not alienate people at the same time. And I think what I've learned, the most important thing is that very often for people who work in tech, we like to do new shiny things, and that's great. But I think we can all agree that in a pandemic, we don't always want a new thing, and we want a reliable thing. And that's been true with the infrastructure that we build on. It's been true of some software practices as well. And I think it also comes back to how when I started, I thought about how, oh, maybe I could just go to this department and show them this cool thing that I built in React. And maybe they would be like, this is cool and I should do it because it's built in React. But it's not always like that, because we have to remember that time and again, people have gone to local or like, you know, any type of governments and said, I can build you this thing. It will only cost $500 million, but it will be new and shiny. But it very often doesn't work, or it very often isn't new or shiny for a very long time. And so I think that all around the world, we're starting to see teams like ours really like step up in order to set the foundations for this type of work later. Elsewhere as well. I think that this community is also very tight-knit. It can be a little bit difficult to break into, but I think that generally people are really open and collaborative to sharing the sort of work that we do and like what works here and like learning from each other. So that keeps me optimistic. So yeah, that concludes my presentation for today. If you'd like to stay in touch, you can reach me in these ways.
Wow, that was wonderful. I think it was very different from most of the product talks that we listen to, where we are mostly talking about the the private sector, and superb. So thank you, Adriana. If people have questions, feel free to ask.
Hey, Arianna, this is
Oh,
Abhinav.
hi.
So you mentioned that working in the public sector is quite different from the private sector in that you don't chase the same things that you do in the private sector. That makes a lot of sense. But let's say in the case of two state governments where the websites are not excellent or they're not very bad, right? How does one determine if what they're doing is adding actual value?
Did you have a specific state in mind?
Oh, no. I'm from India, so I really can't compare. all of our websites are just as good or bad.
Yeah, I think that's a good question. I don't think anyone has really come up with like an indicator of like success for like city or other government websites, but I think that in time we might settle on some metrics around like how easy it is to like get the information that you need. Like, you know, it shouldn't take you like more than like 5 different websites, for example, or sections to find like very simple info. We might also start having measures around like how usable it is. Does it work on mobile phones that might not be the latest iPhone or Android? I think this is a really interesting indicator because very often, you know, we don't have to think about that. We're building stuff in startups, but here, like, it's absolutely important to do that type of testing. Mm-hmm. And I guess it's also like how much you can do with your government online. So I know we've always had like online services, but to be frank, they've always been extremely difficult, or like it feels like a very large effort to do. And so maybe in time we'll be all judged on how easy it is. And I hope that we'll get there at some point.
Right.
So, hey, Arianna, maybe a bit philosophical, yeah, but given the fact that you have worked across like both the private space in the past and now you're working in the capacity in the public space, right? Maybe again in the US, right? And I'm coming with an assumption here that folks in general are more tech aware, maybe even decision makers in the public space as well, right? But say in a lot of other places, I think the divide is pretty huge, right? So let me take Indonesia as an example, right? Where a lot of digitization and even the services coming online is primarily been driven so far, at least by the private space, right? By all of these startups. Now, of course, especially in these times, it becomes more so critical that people talk, like the private and the public space works together, because at the end, the impact is for everyone in the society, right? So based on your experience, if you could shed some light in terms of how startups or folks in the private space can, meaningfully work and align their priorities and objectives in the public space, that would really, really help. And sorry to cut into the queue of questions, Divakar. Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that every place, even down to like the town or city level, has a very different like relationship between the public and private sector. And so in a place like Indonesia, for example, it's just at such a different level, I think, of development. And you really need to have like, I think, very strong, at least in the beginning, very strong advocates for this type of work in order for it to happen. So I think in Singapore's case, I remember I was like, having so much trouble doing like very basic things online not too long ago. And then it very suddenly became really good. And it was like, what happened? And I guess, and then I read a story about how there was an engineer who basically went rogue at the country's like IT department, and he just started doing things in a very like startup-y way. But then his boss, instead of saying that, hey, you should not do that on company time, he was actually like, what can I do to support you? And then from there, that team grew bigger and bigger, and they started doing a lot of like experiments and a lot of really interesting things. And so I don't always agree with some of the work that they do, but I feel like it was an example of how if you have a certain level of commitment and some types of champions to push for this type of work, then I think change can happen. In Indonesia, I think that they're lucky in the sense that the size of the market is so large that like everyone is interested in doing something, to the extent that even if they're not moving as quickly as they should, I think there's still a lot of room for people to figure out. I think that at this stage, it's a lot of dependence on like relationships in between the public and private sector in that market. And it'll probably continue to be that way. But I feel like given that there are like a handful of really established power players there, it might just be a matter of if this large conglomerate and this like minister and some entrepreneur decides to advocate for a certain thing to happen, then I feel like it will happen, which is a lot more than I can say for a lot of other smaller developing countries.
Hey, Adrianna. Rupen here. I had a question. So for our company, we try and pitch a lot of government business. And your last slide, I think, made me thinking that when we pitch, it's always the shiny new things that get pitched. But when you were saying, I got thinking that are we pitching the right thing? What is the best way to understand what a government wants? Right? Because again, US in the different cultures, but there is a level of opaqueness, I think, which is inherent to any government. And how do you get around that?
Yeah, so I think that I first and I've worked in a lot of different markets, and you're right, there's a lot of opaqueness in a lot of these places and elsewhere, even here. But I feel like I always start from the idea of like asking what are the things that this person I'm dealing with, or this department that I'm dealing with, what do they care about, right? So if this team came to me and said, hey, we need to get this grant up by this time, if I was only approaching it from a product or tech perspective, I would only hear what type of app they wanted and by when. But if I went a step further and tried to understand, okay, who is this person? What is their background? What are they really asking for here, right? So at some point, I might be like, okay, they're really asking for help in easily creating an application that would help them do this thing that they would have to do with or without me. So how can I help them do that thing better? So that's, I think, what's really helped me a lot. Like, how can you help this person be successful? But in order to answer that question, you need to figure out what they care most about. So is it about saving money? Then you could like tweak your pitch that way. Or is it about like, increasing market share? I think you could have the same product, but like if they had those two competing goals, then that would be very different.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Hi, Adrianna, it's Puneet here.
Hi.
First of all, glad that you put back the Indian sleeper class expert back on Twitter.
Thanks.
Yeah, so I've been following you for quite some time now. So my question was more of the background of the acceptance. So how do you think it works best? So did USDS come first and then the state and the counties and the cities had more acceptance towards this, or was it more ground up? And what do you think works best in a country like India, Indonesia, and all these places? So that was my question as to how to make this acceptance inherent in the system.
Yeah, I think here was a very ground up approach in that, you know, a lot of the people who were part of that original group that did the work that they did on healthcare.gov and then went on to form USDS. I think that there had to be a lot of like partnerships between organizations and government in order to that to happen. So I think that if, for example, the local government here had not said, okay, maybe it would be great if like Google could like donate like X hours of their engineers' time in order to do this very specific thing, which I think was about figuring out ideas to like, you know, do housing stuff better for like low-cost housing, then there might not have been people in government who would be supportive of the idea that we can and maybe we should work with like private organizations from time to time. And I think that once that happened, people were able to see that, you know, this isn't a necessarily better way of working, but it's just a different way of working, and they were exposed to it. And I think they were able to then say, I can take the best ideas and the best things about it and apply it to my space as well. So I think for here, this was definitely something that happened. Maybe in other places, I feel like it would be great if we could have like strong local community leaders who were advocates for this type of work. But I think that that's also hard because there haven't been a lot of opportunities to do this type of work in a lot of other places. So then how can you have like a strong community around it if it doesn't exist? So there's definitely going to be a period, I think, of thinking about this in some capacity, some type of like community building. I think that India is in a really good place for this type of work because, you know, first of all, the engineering culture is really strong, but also the culture of like having grassroots organizations organizing around like certain topics and fighting really hard in that space. I think that maybe eventually we'll get to a point where this is going to like really help, maybe at a state level first.
Thanks.
Hi, Adrianna. This is Shashank, and I live in Singapore. I just had a couple of questions around at the risk of sounding too political. Do you think GovTech in SF has any plans for shelter homes and homelessness, especially in the situation? And another question is, Singapore, the GovTech in Singapore developed Trace Together, where it sort of enables contact tracing. Do you think SF, and since you're the product director, it's open source, will you adopt it? And does that infringe on your integrity in terms of how much data you collect and so on? So.
Yeah, so I'll answer the second piece first because I think that's very close to my heart as well. So I think that as a city, we have very strong standards and viewpoints on things like surveillance and data. So I think that in general, we strive to not collect unnecessary data, and surveillance is definitely a big no. I think we were the first city in the world to ban, I think, facial recognition as a city. And I think that generally and politically speaking, the trend continues in that way. And I think on the topic of contact tracing, it comes down to not, you know, I was initially against the idea completely, but now I feel like it's a matter of like how it's done. So I don't have a lot of information on like what works better than others, but I think that the Singaporean way of doing it is definitely not an approach that I would take for here. And so when I said earlier that there were a lot of things that I disagreed with the teams doing this work back home, I think that was specifically what I had in mind. I think today we saw Google and Apple announcing their own versions of it, and I haven't dug fully into the information, but it looks like the Apple approach of doing things where it's more of an opt-in, Bluetooth-based, rather than location tracking method, could be one approach to thinking about contact tracing, but it's not something that we immediately have plans to implement. I think that as a city, we are working with some researchers in Stanford and elsewhere to think about how this can or should be done, if at all. I think generally that we think it's important to have some level of like contact tracing, but exactly how we should do it, I am not involved in that process, but I certainly have thoughts on how it should not be surveillance based. With regards to the question about like the homeless population, I think that as we see this virus explode everywhere else in the world, we see that it is a privilege to be able to stay home and work from home, and that the people who are going to be disproportionately affected by it in any society are the people who are most marginalized. So in San Francisco, it's the homeless population. It's a really, really big problem here. I think the population is like 10,000 or more at this point is homeless here in the richest, one of the richest cities in the world. And today we found a cluster of, I think, 70 infections in one of the biggest homeless shelters here. So I think over the next few days, we'll be dealing with the fallout of that. We don't really have, scope or opportunity to work on like every part of the city that is experiencing problems, although I would definitely love to be involved in something that could like help the homeless at some point, but that's not something that we do right now. I guess I'm personally like interested and involved in some ways with like how we are reacting to or like helping the homeless population here. I don't think anyone's really figured out exactly what to do, because like you want to put them in a shelter or you don't, or you build a shelter and then like rich people complain about it, usually like rich techie people, and you just can't please everybody. So I think it's a very difficult question to get around, but I certainly hope that the marginalized get the help they need. In Singapore, I was disappointed to hear the minister say that this is really like something like this is really two type 2 infections, like one for locals, like, and like rich people basically, and one for like migrant workers, usually from Bangladesh and elsewhere, who live in very cramped quarters and dormitories. And obviously they are suffering a lot right now with the lockdown and close quarters. And we're also seeing more and more infections there. So I guess overall, there isn't really anything I can think of from a product perspective to help the marginalized face this issue at this point anyway. I think that it has to come on a policy level, and hopefully one that's more humane than what we have right now anywhere.
Thanks.
Yeah.
Yes.
Hi, Adrianna. This is Chandran Uchari again. Yeah. So I had a couple of questions. I would like to take them one by one.
Sure.
So one, Adrianna, I completely agree with the statement made by you that government folks do not think from an end user perspective when they propose something. So, it's with respect to how do you deal with the change of speed for the action? Like in my in one of the projects for G, which we were like some few days ago, it was on e-invoicing, which was like from an India government. It was an ad hoc request, right? So it had caught us off guard. So that's the difference which it was there between the government and the end users who are actually using that feature in their day in day out activities, right? So how do you deal with that kind of ad hoc requests, and how do you change the speed of action in terms of those kind of requests?
Yeah, so I think that at the beginning of all of this, it was very difficult to really understand what was going on. So I think in essence, we just said yes to everything because we felt like we had to. But now that like we're sort of 4+ weeks in, things, I wouldn't say that it feels more stable, but it's more like, okay, we have a better sense of how this is something that is ongoing for some time. So for example, with some projects that were a little bit stuck before the pandemic, like some teams did not want to do like certain things with us. But after that, like it was like an existential thing that you just had to do it no matter what. So I think that having that as a driving force is a key determinator of like the speed in which things get done. But at the same time, I think as product people, it's really important to put boundaries around and definitions around what done means and what it is even. And to really like ask like why they want certain things a certain way, and whether or not like we could actually find like a better solution that would be simpler. And I think that's what I'm really learning right now. How do we simplify things, but do things quickly in this time?
Sure. Yeah, thank you for that, Adrianna. That makes sense. So yeah, on the next part, I was seeing your slide in that you had put up pandemic wish list, right? So just wanted to understand the attitude or we should be, because all the solutions which you're seeing around with respect to the COVID pandemic is more of a reactive in nature rather than proactive. So what should be the attitude there, or what should be the mindset there of a product manager when we develop solutions? Because like we cannot get caught off guard, right? So for these kind of situations, so just wanted to know your thoughts there.
I think it really comes down to your own perspective on this. So like for me personally, I feel like though I don't think work, for example, will ever be the same again after this. I think that the world as well is going to change in very drastic ways, and nobody really knows how. But I would think that we are also exploring at the same time better ways of working together. So for example, like maybe it's okay if the majority of like city employees or government employees work from home. I mean, like right now we absolutely have no choice, but maybe it means that later when things are better, we have a more flexible attitude towards like things like work hours and like working from home, where compared to tech companies, we definitely haven't had that. So from a product manager standpoint, I would try to design and plan for this as a possibility, or maybe even an eventuality, rather than like a once in a generation experience. So I think it's definitely going to force us to think in terms of resiliency of the way we do our work, as well as the products that we build and the infrastructure behind it.
Okay, thank you. Thank you so much, Arianna.
So Adrianna, we just have a couple more questions. I hope it's fine. We're not keeping you away for too long on your Friday evening.
It's not like I have anywhere else to go.
Oh, true for all of us.
Yeah.
Okay, cheers.
Yeah, Arianna,
Hey.
thanks for the talk. I think it was, it's a very different perspective of looking at things. So I have a couple of things. One, I have something to share with everyone based on what you said, and then I have a question.
Okay.
So when you told us about the UK government websites, it's interesting because I've been using the UK government websites digital marketplace for a while. So I work in enterprise products, and when you're doing like analysis of how other people are pricing, it's notoriously difficult to find how people price their products, all of that. So the UK government has something called a digital marketplace, where it's actually given a very detailed list of all their software vendors and how they price for the UK government. So I think that's a very good resource that anybody working in enterprise products can use to sort of just understand how other people price their products. So I'm just like pasting the link on the chat for anyone to use.
Thank you.
And the question I had was, for government products, for at least for any other kind of products, the way to get user feedback is relatively simpler. Like you can either talk to users, or you can you understand from their behavior, you understand key metrics, government products where you're building for such a wide variety of people, how do you go get user feedback?
Yeah, so for that, we actually have a user research team. And so we do it slightly differently in the sense that like it's not just like product feedback we need, it's also like, you know, how do you feel when using this, for example. So our user research team, which is fairly new, has been really important during this time. So even during the application process, the one that we built for businesses to like get reimbursed for the expenditure that they've had so that they can pay their employees, we had a really short time frame. I think it was something like 5 days to go live. But even during that time, we were able to do a user research thing with at least 5 people. That was pretty in-depth. And I remember the morning of launch, we were watching videos, actually audio clips of people we didn't know using the thing that we had built and saying, I don't understand this, or this makes me feel like this way. And we generally just want to make sure that like we have everything right. And so having that process in place at this time felt really important as well. Even before all of this happened, even before we had the user research team, because of the nature of the users that we have, for example, like how do you communicate certain information to a person who is homeless, right? Luckily, our office is really close to the main library here, which is, if you've watched City of Angels, the Nicolas Cage movie, is the building where all the angels were standing a really long time ago. So it's a really interesting building. It's also the only library, I think, in the US that has a full-time social worker because of the number of homeless people who use it as a place to go to the restroom, to take respite from the heat that happens sometimes. And it's generally a place where you can, you know, have meet different people at the same time. And so the user research team and the product managers would very often go there with like a specific goal, and they will work with the librarians around recruiting certain people to do things like, you know, if you're a Chinese speaker, can you tell me if like the machine translations of the website make sense? And from that, we learned that Google Translate was at a time translating the mayor's name completely wrong. It was like calling her a British horse or something like that, something really, really terrible. And we just could not, like, obviously we just had to do something about that. And so having access to different communities, we also work with like community partners like Filipino organizations. We also work with Latino organizations. But we also, I think, have to be very mindful of the fact that we can't just always ask people to do something because it's a good thing to do. So we definitely have to be very mindful and respectful of the things that we're asking for, as well as of their time. And obviously, being a government, we can't give money to like participate in a thing. So we have to work with nonprofits to, for example, give grocery vouchers to people who do participate. So I think that the overall process is very similar in terms of how we think about user research as anywhere else, but I think it's the how we do it and who we talk to that might differ.
Yeah. Thanks, Raja. You can ask next.
Hey, Andrea. That was a great presentation. I think this is one of the first meetups I'm come across where someone who has an experience with who worked very closely with the government and definitely is throwing us a lot of insights over here. I have a question because you work very close with the government. So are you guys planning of using any digital products or any possible collaborations to help to take action on food supplies? There are certain patterns that I've seen across the world that are rising. For example, in Singapore and Abu Dhabi, Indo farming is on rise. And here in India, the private firms are adding grocery as a feature, and they're collaborating with companies which have fleet to do the last mile delivery. For example, Flipkart is collaborating with Uber for doing the last mile delivery. So any new emerging trends or any collaboration or any product approach that you're planning to deal with product supplies over there?
Yeah, so this is a really different market in the sense that before when I was working in like Singapore, Indonesia, I always tell people that it feels like there's opportunity here in terms of how like there are still things to build, but here it feels like there have been market leaders in almost every space. And so unfortunately here in our case, Instacart has been like the market leader in this space. And so there's really like a culture of exploitation in that company. And so even though I think it's an idea that I support, that we should have like programs like that, the concerns here are actually around policy rather than product. And it's around how do we make sure that the gig workers are being treated better and that restaurants are like not being charged like crazy like fees just to have delivery through these platforms. So as a team, I don't see anything that we can really like build or improve on in this space. But I think that as a city, we should be taking steps to making sure that people are not being exploited in this situation, which is actually what we're seeing happen right now. There was a horrible story recently about how people who use Instacart would do things like they would say that they would give like a really, really big tip. And then just before arriving at the house with the delivery, they would change it to like $1 or something. And so I think there are a lot of questions, less around supply or last mile, just because this is actually a really small city. It doesn't seem like it, but it's only 7 miles by 7 miles in size. And it's also relatively small. So I think that the supply lines are pretty good because we're so close to like the agricultural farmlands and that we have good farmers locally and everything. So it's more an issue of resource allocation instead of like delivery. Like people have very few problems getting things delivered. There's also community programs where people are like cycling around to help like get deliveries for like seniors or disabled people. But yeah, to answer your question, I don't know if there's much else we can do other than to try to like reduce the possibility of exploitation of people in the gig economy here.
Thank you, Adrianna.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you. I have a question to Adrianna.
Sure.
I think working in all the startups and we are always so focused on efficiency, which makes us figure out the right segments of users, who are the power users, where we have to put our energy, who are the users which will give us the maximum bang for the buck. But the kind of products that you are making, you can't do that, right? You have to be inclusive. It doesn't matter if a group is really small, but all lives are equally important for the products that you are building. What are some of these lessons on inclusivity that all of us who are working in private companies building products can learn from the products that you are building?
Yeah, so I think that for every company, it's safe to assume that at some point you're going to have to grow beyond like the initial group of people that made your service successful. And maybe the needs of these other groups are going to change the offerings of some of your products. So how do you like balance all these groups at once? I think it's going to be very difficult for many growing companies who are trying to scale. And in fact, I guess many of them don't really succeed in expanding that group that they can serve significantly anyway. So I would probably advise that like it would be great to start thinking about other types of users as early as possible. And so here we always say that like, we don't want to build things just for like a person who works in tech who lives in San Francisco, right? There are so many other people. There are undocumented people, there are migrant workers, there are people who have come from other countries who come to live here. And sometimes trying to understand the entire universe of those possibilities is a very difficult process, but I think that's something that I enjoy thinking about. But for everybody else, there are a few specific things to consider. So one, how is this product accessed, right? So is it on a smartphone or is it on a not smartphone? If it's on a smartphone, is it on like a device of a certain screen size and below? Because that would be very different. I would even think about what is the cost of accessing your service, right? So there was an interesting calculator that I saw, something like a speed calculator, but instead of measuring internet speed, it told you how much a user who accessed this website would pay in terms of like data access rates. And so that was also a really interesting way to think about it, because if you have like a static site but it loads really large images and you don't really do any pressing stuff, then someone who, you know, for example, when I was living in Indonesia, and I was very frequently in like very rural areas, it was really hard for me to like read certain like websites because of like how like long it would take to load and things like that, and how much it costs in terms of data. So cost and accessibility. I think user research is always a really important tool for every product manager, no matter what you're building. So try to do as much of that as you can and learn as much of it as you can. I don't think we can all be experts in that, but at least like having a user researcher mindset is definitely something that can help you in all parts of product management. And I guess lastly, really taking a moment to consider certain types of so-called edge cases. It's probably tempting to like, you know, ignore that, but I think that there are far more people who use screen readers or who are colorblind or who are like, you know, accessing things very differently from you and me. And I think developing a certain amount of empathy around that. Obviously, we can't do everything all at once, but I think even having the thought of what it would be like for someone who's different from you using your product is definitely like a really important like first step.
Thank you. So we have just one last question from Rupin, and then we'll close the session.
Hey, Adrianna. So it's very linked to the question that Diwakar asked. That, you know, because you know, while we do private company product management, there are defined metrics that we chase. But in your case, how do you, you know, for a government, what are the metrics? How do you even arrive at the metrics, and how do you know that, you know, the product has delivered?
Yeah. So that's a good question. I think that that's something that we're still trying to figure out as well. We haven't always had like a great, like, you know, way to measure a lot of the impact of our work. But I think that as we go further along during this like event and we do more and more of this type of work, I think the metrics are going to be like, for me personally anyway, like what was the dollar value of the like business grants that we were able to like give out as a result of like the work that we did on like grant application. And then I would be interested in eventually at some point finding out from the business owners what that experience was like compared to like before, or what they were expecting, what were some of the issues or comments that they ran into qualitatively. I would be interested in that. I would also be interested to say, like, do surveys to see if business owners in certain communities, like maybe Spanish speaking communities, like, did they hear about this event or or this application, or did they not? Because then that would contribute towards some sort of an equity score for me. That would be important, but that's not something that we're tracking right now, other than at a very like granular level. So yeah, I guess the answer to that is that we're still figuring it out. In GovTech, there's just this sense of, okay, things are different. And a lot of the tools that are out there for measuring things or satisfaction or impact isn't really directly applicable to me, because like the conversion stuff isn't always purchasing something. And the majority of tools are built for that. So I think that in the next phase of this type of work, a lot of us are going to have to think about how we're going to do that and why it matters.
Broad scope there for you. Thanks, Adrianna.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you, everyone.